And it's really good to see some familiar faces that I haven't seen in a long time. So, Luisa, good seeing you again. Sylvia and Michael. Mr. P, what's up? It's been a long time.
Okay.
Good seeing you.
Nice seeing you.
Yeah, it's good seeing Claudine and some folks that I haven't seen in a while. So this is great. As you guys know, that we've been doing continuing the series, uh, Filipino American History month. We started off with the Yakima Valley, and also Seattle, and Claire Miranda's Dreamland movie that's in the works. Then last week we had Mel Orpelia's No History, No Self presentation, which was really well received. Both of them were. And today we are embarking in our third presentation. We are very honored to have two very distinguished guests, giants in the Filipino American literature community, Dr. Luisa Igloria and Peter Bacho, to be with us today. And I'm really excited about what they have to say about literature, and also hear more about their journey through their art, and also talking about Filipino American identity. My name is Ray Obispo. I'm the president of Fawns Hampton Roads, and we are really honored to be hosting the Fanhs Now event. And I'm going to be posting in the chat, check it every now and again, about some links, and also some of the upcoming presentations that we have for the rest of the month of October. Also know that Fawns is always in the mood to get new members. And we're hoping that you guys join Fawns if you're in the Hampton Roads area, Fawns HR, or you can join the Fawns chapter in your region, so we can get programming like this funded, and also really supporting the idea of Filipino American history as we move forward. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Alan Bragano, who has been running these meetings. Let's give Alan a big round of applause for what he's done, and also Edwina for their vision of putting all this together. Go ahead, Alan.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everybody. As tradition, we're going to begin our session with a moment of silence. So let's kindly bow our heads and think about those who cannot be with us, especially those that left the Philippines to come to America, who put a roof over our heads, clothes on our back, food in our stomachs, to provide us opportunities that were denied to them. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started here. This is our Fawns Now, like Ray said, is our third presentation of 7, and these are first of all, you guys should have received this handout prior to the meeting. There's a lot of good information on these in these hyperlinks. I encourage you to seek and study those either during or afterwards, and it'll be worth your while to save this. Like Fawns Legacy Month is really our chapter. This is our 30th anniversary as a Fawns chapter. Fawns Legacy Month is a gift as well as Fawns Now. And these are the gifts that we're giving Fawns to keep the organization relevant and thriving for the future. Here's a link there on the Fawns Youth Summit, which happened on October 12th, 1997. This is pretty significant here because in 1994, Peter Bacho was here on behalf of a presentation in the MacArthur Memorial. He was here to present the 50th anniversary of the Leyte landings. And that happened to be the first meeting for the student body at Salem High School, where Ray Obispo was the founding teacher. And they wanted to do something for Filipino American History Month. And so I brought along Peter Bacho and Alex Fabros, who both are top scholars in Fawns, to say a few words to the students. So they went in, the room was packed. There must have been about 150, 200 students. And Peter and Alex started to talk about the history. But a current thing happened was the students were freaking bored. I saw students in the back, they were in there, they had Walkmans back there, up there nodding their heads going like this. I saw a couple, they were making out. And then I saw two people in the back, they were wrestling. So since you remember that, huh, Peter? So since they're just completely bored, and I said, "Oh man, this is a tough crowd." And so we just afterwards, Peter said, "Oh, these are just high school kids, and we don't want to, kind of deal with them. You gotta, short attention span and so forth and so on." So the next year, Ray contacted me and said, "Hey, we want to do another Filipino American History Month presentation." I said, "Wait a minute. Peter Bacho and Alex Faros, they totally bombed. Why do you want me to go up there?" And so, I took it as a challenge because what we had to figure out was you can't just teach history straight up. And so we had to think of an angle. And so what I was thinking of is, okay, let's start doing some poetry, some spoken word, some dramatizations, because these are in fact just acts of expressing the history. So instead of teaching it, they're going to act it. They're going to make it come alive. And so that was 95. They didn't understand, but they started to get the hang of it. And so by 97, we had youth groups coming in from New York, New Jersey, Florida. They all congregated and they all started to perform Filipino American experience of their area. And it was very, very enlightening. It was powerful because one of the requisites that we said was, if we're going to portray ourselves, we're not going to sing and we're not going to dance. And so I want you guys to take a look at those those dramatizations because they're pretty powerful in a sense that I was so proud of these students because they performed magnificently. And I wanted to share that with you because that's the anniversary date where we didn't bomb versus what Peter had to do. So thank you, Peter, because you inspired us to teach kids a different way. The next one here is the Virginia Beach Proclamation, where 2 weeks ago, City of Virginia Beach proclaimed Filipino History Month here. And then like Ray said, we encourage membership. So when we take the poll as far as who's registering, approximately 40% of you guys out there aren't even members. And so I encourage you to, at this point, we're going to give you a discount. For $10, you could join us. Okay, just put down you're a student and just come on in, and at least we should be worth more than a bag of popcorn, at a movie. Okay, think of it like that. Here's some future programs that we have. We started off with the Yakima Valley. And what you have here, you have the outline presentation. No history, no self. Today is the literature. Next, on Sunday, we have We Are Fawns, which is an attempt to do the history of our organization itself. This is the first attempt. There's so much to cover in Fawns. So what we're doing is, I asked Auntie Dorothy, okay, pick your memorable conferences. So this is going to be a surprise as far as which conferences she chooses. So tune in, find out how different conferences affected our organization, how we started to bloom. Then we have the PCC on the 25th. Then Virginia Wasn't for Lovers, that's on the 27th. But also, when ending up, we're going to talk about the Filipino American Vietnam veterans, and also my court case where activism, if this is supposed to be about activism, I had to learn everything about activism and applied it at this case where I sued the city of Virginia Beach and we won. Okay. Now here's, I want you guys to, the history. Peter wanted to do his activism. He wanted to cover the unions in Seattle, the salmon canneries, Alaska salmon canneries, the worker unions. So here's a lot of good articles that I encourage you guys to look at, to read about. And there's some articles there on Seattle. Literary activism. Carlos Bolasan, he was one of our first literature people. There's Luisa Igloria. I put those down because they're in Wikipedia. To me, I think that's pretty cool because now you got some Filipinos on Wikipedia who happen to be some of our top writers. And these are some poems that Luisa picked out for you guys to check out. America Returns, You Can't Talk to Us Like That. This one called Certified. There's a box, when you click that on, there's a box to the left. You click that box and it brings up the poem. This one here, Dear Federico, type in Luisa Igloria and you will get a vocal presentation, or she performs this poem vocally. Then Peter kindly had this, shared his writings on Seattle, map 1 and map 2. So a lot of good stuff. These are the bios of Luisa and Peter. You guys could look through that. So let's start our presentation. I'm gonna ask both of them these questions and I'll have you guys answer, and we'll just go right down and let's see what you guys have to, say about this. So Luisa, how did you start in literature?
How did I start as a writer?
Yes.
Well, I can trace that to very early on because my parents taught me to read very early. So learning to read early, I think, made it possible for me to become an early writer also.
You're in the Philippines at this time. You're not in Virginia Beach, right? This is...
Yes. Yeah, I grew up in the Philippines in Baguio.
Okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. Did you want more on that?
Oh yeah, like how'd you get started? You started to read. Did you start to write at the same time? Like what were you writing about?
Yeah, little stories. I didn't really get serious about my poetry until I was in my later years of high school and then in college because I was part of the student paper at the University of the Philippines. And I think my teachers, having teachers who encouraged me, was also a very key factor in the shaping of my writing career. I like to tell the story of how my father was a lawyer and he had dreams that I would follow in his profession, but my parents also thought that they wanted me to consider music as a career. So I also took music lessons. I played the piano from the age of 3. I had this sort of recital when I was 15, and I could have gone on to conservatory, but I like to say that when I hit college, my English teachers kidnapped me for life. So here I am. Yeah. And I've never turned back. And then after I graduated college, my teachers in college by then had become my colleagues. I had joined the faculty at UP Baguio, and I was just an instructor very early on. But then my teachers, who are now my colleagues, said, it's time for you to test your work out there and send it out for publication and try entering competitions too. So with their goading, encouragement, I entered a folio of poems to the Carlos Palanca Awards when I was 21. And to my great shock, I won first prize.
Like what did you write about? Were you writing about food?
I was writing poems about Baguio, and I think it's still a very important part of what I do. I write about place, I write about history, I write about the sense of the individual.
It's making my head hurt. What? I'm listening to this thing, man. What to play?
Hey, mute that guy. Mute that guy.
Did I interrupt something?
It's Oscar.
Okay.
Where's my security? Go ahead, Luisa.
So anyway, that's kind of started the whole thing rolling, and then the poems that I had entered and that won first prize in the Palanca that year, I developed more poems, and it became my first full-length collection of poetry, which is titled Cartography. Nice. And they're poems on Baguio.
And I understand you've written one poem a day. Now, when did your streak start?
It's almost 10 years that I would have kept my writing, my daily writing practice. So I started in November of 2010,
Hmm.
and it will be 10 years in a month.
Good, 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 good.
And I
Okay,
have a
Peter.
new book, so commercial.
Oh, okay. Peter, how did you get started in literature?
I really didn't. I got started in writing policy. I was writing for uh, foreign policy journals like Science Review out of Johns Hopkins and the Journal of International Affairs. That's out of Columbia University. But mostly I was writing for the editorial page of Christian Science Monitor, which at that time was a very influential journal in terms of foreign policy. And my foreign policy issue was the Philippines and the post-Marcos era.
Hmm.
And I was arguing very strongly that U.S. policy, which at the time was inclined to defend the bases, the U.S. massive military presence there in the Philippines, that in the middle of the Civil War was, from the U.S. perspective, absolutely stupid. And so the good guys won, the bad guys lost, and I was left without a job. But for anyone who plays with words, as I was doing extensively in the 80s, there comes a time when you're analyzing situations and facts and what have you, that you come to a point, well, how about if I have a chance? You're analyzing someone else's facts. These are the facts as they are. And just like a chess player, you say, if you know, player A moves here, player B moves there, and this is going to be the outcome. But at some point in time, anyone who plays with facts that they're given wonders, well, what if I created the facts? What if I created the universe and created people to inhabit this universe and controlled their outcomes, put them in conflict, control their outcomes, determine who lives, determine who dies, et cetera, et cetera. That is very attractive, and I'm convinced that for many fiction writers, people who become fiction writers at least, the lure of fiction, which is so unpredictable and there really aren't a whole lot of rules, is basically the lure of divinity. You create the universe, you determine who lives and dies, you take responsibility for the outcome. And sure enough, like a sucker, I took the bait in the late 1980s and ended up with Cebu, which is like kind of stupid when you think about it, because usually when you step into another realm, you start with something a little bit more manageable, like a short story. But I woke up one morning and said, I'm going to write a novel, which is like the dumbest thing I've ever thought about in my life. And sure enough, that novel was Cebu.
Okay, that was a very good novel. I do recall your mom always, every gathering would sell your book.
Well, my dad used to sell them at funerals.
At my dad's funeral. But that's okay. That's okay.
Buy this book.
You'll buy this now. That's my son.
Buy this now. This is my son.
There you go. Okay, let's go on. Question number 2. Okay, what is Filipino American literature? Is it anything written by Filipino American considered Filipino American lit? Is it, if the theme is Filipino American, is that considered Filipino American literature? Or do you have to be Filipino American to write works considered to be Filipino American lit? Luisa.
Well, I'm going to take a long route answering that kind of question. As I said, I was, I grew up in Baguio City. The first time that I came to the US was in 1992 when I was 30 in order to pursue my doctoral studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. But the interesting thing about Baguio is that it was created as a hill station for the American colonial government, right? In the islands in the 1900s. And Chicago architect Daniel Burnham was brought there to draft the blueprint for the city, the hill station. And many of the street names and place names to this day bear the marks of that colonial encounter with America. For instance, the main thoroughfare, I'm sure some of you in the audience may have been to Baguio. So the main thoroughfare is Session Road. The mountain road to Baguio is Cannon Road, named after the American military officer Lyman Cannon, who led the engineering core in its construction. There's Cabinet Hill, Leonard Wood Road, Harrison Road, Malcolm Square, all of these vestiges of encounter with the Philippine American War and with America. Therefore, I felt like I had encountered America even prior to my physical arrival here. And there's also the language thing, right? I mean, we were taught English. I went to an elementary school where we were fined 5 centavos for every word that we spoke in the vernacular during school hours. So of course I learned, my English very well. But at the same time, growing up, I felt like I was exposed to 3 languages simultaneously. So Ilocano, Filipino or Tagalog, and English. So part of me wants to say, why could I not claim English as a first language too? I mean, it's what my consciousness, my awareness came to those 3 languages at the same time. Now, when I left for Chicago for grad school in '92, at that time, I did not really think I would remain in America for the long term. But whenever I would participate in literary programs or events, I was part of the Pintig cultural group in Chicago
Yes, I remember them.
for a while, part of the educational and cultural committee. But anyway, I would participate in literary programs or events, especially among other Filipino communities. And I would often get asked questions like, are you Phil Am or are you Phil Phil? So I suppose it means they were trying to ask me whether I centered my Filipino or Filipinx identity in a North American context, or was my sensibility still primarily defined by Filipino culture over there in the Philippines? So I've always felt a great deal of discomfort with that kind of a binary, especially since it took me some time to actually decide to apply for naturalization. And at the same time, I did not cut my teeth in the US academic setting, which for me also felt very liberating because I could call on other models of literature and tell my students, hey, there are global traditions of literature that can enrich your own understanding of your writing and your reading and what you can do. Peter was talking about building worlds. There's more than one way to do that. And there's more than one tradition that we can tap in order to learn things about how to do that, strategies to do that. So when I came to the US and confronted with the idea of this question that you posed, what is Filipino American literature? Of course, we think immediately of people like Bulosan. We also think about people like Jose Garcia Villa, right? It was very interesting. And the two, I think, Bulosan and Villa, the way we can think about them as kind of like part of that same binary. One of them, Bulosan, of course, is very much involved in community organizing. And so his literature is like a literature that is rooted in the struggle of our communities. And then you have you have Villa, who is more sort of like interested in not just form, but ways in which he could advance other kinds of ideas that Filipinos could embrace in America as writers. So I admire both of them for different things. But I don't think that that's all there is. So there is socially engaged literature on the one hand, and there is maybe something like, I don't want to call it art for art's sake, but this idea that we need to also pay attention to questions of craft, questions of language. So between the two of them, I also feel very dissatisfied by the sharp polarization of these viewpoints. But I'm excited to look around and see that not only among Asian American writers, among Filipino American writers, there's such a exciting new growth in the field. And there is more than one way, really, more than just this binary that history shows us, and we have looked at this for a while now. There's more than one way to be a writer in Filipino American contexts. But then I guess the context that defines or is common to all of these writers is their experiences as writers in America, contending with all of the different crises, all of the different struggles, all of the different ways in which they are called upon to say things about who they are and what their identity is or what they would like to envision in terms of that. That's a long-winded way of answering your question, but I'm not even sure I answered it completely, but.
I get it. I get it. Peter.
What's the question, Alan?
What is Filipino American literature? Is it anything written by a Filipino American considered Fil-Am Lit? If the theme is written on the Filipino American experience, is that considered Fil-Am Lit? Or do you have to be Filipino American to write works to be
First of all, I don't think you have to be Filipino American to write Filipino American lit. To be honest, I don't think effective literature, good literature, great literature is necessarily ethnically it's not an ethnic prerequisite. I mean, I'm thinking about one novel which was absolutely spellbinding. It was called In Darkness, about the revolution in Haiti. It was written by a person who was not from Haiti, but it was compelling. Filipino American lit has historically represented the experience here in the United States from the early part of the 20th century to today, and it reflects that experience. For me, at least. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if a Filipino American writer wants to go write about beautiful things for the sake of beauty, that's fine and good, but it isn't necessarily Filipino American lit. But it has to reflect the experience, the historical experience that Pinoys have gone through here in this country. That's what I consider it to be.
Okay, okay. Question number 3. Luisa, name your top 2 Filipino American author prior to 1970 and why?
Well, I already mentioned Bulosan and Jose Garcia Villa, and probably I would go back to that, but I think their experiences are also reflective of how we continue to struggle with the idea of representation in publishing or in writing. For instance, Jose Garcia Villa, who was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize actually in 1943, was yet described as a minor American writer in anthologies. So even if he had made it in certain circles in New York, he remained relatively unknown, even up until his death. So Villa and Bulosan, I think, are the 2 examples I would call upon for,
Prior to
writers that we should look at before, did you say before the 70s?
Yeah, 1970.
Yeah. And of course, there's also N.B.M. Gonzalez and Bienvenido and Santos, who wrote fiction.
Yes, yes. Peter, name your top 2.
Well, obviously Carlos. He's not my favorite writer, but what America does is and does so effectively is first of all, he describes the reasons for immigration in the first place, the destruction of the Philippine countryside. I mean, you can take a look at an academic who I really respect, a guy by the name of Ben Kirklead, who wrote The Huck Rebellion. And he describes the situation in areas of the Philippines which had huge immigration in the United States, the Ilocos and a little bit further south. And it's because the countryside was falling apart. The countryside was falling apart. People were becoming impoverished and organizing. And in the 1930s, at least, I would argue that they were probably on the verge of rebellion against the landed elite. So, I mean, for people from that part of the Philippines and from other parts of the Philippines, one of the reasons that these primarily men came to the West Coast of the United States is because they had no choice. It's either you leave the Philippines, which is starting to fall apart, particularly in the countryside, or you organize and you get ready to fight and quite possibly die. Well, what happened, of course, in 1941 is the Japanese invaded and kind of interrupted all of that organization. But you know, you take a look at the history of the Huks. What they were basically the pre-war peasant organizations which now had established the military arm. I mean, the organization was already there in Central Luzon. And they'd established a military arm, and they ended up being very, very effective. But so, I mean, you know, for people from the countryside during the American regime, life was increasingly difficult, and that goes a long way. You can either read Ben Kirkley, it's the Huk Rebellion, if you want, which I think is a wonderful academic book, or you can read the first 90 pages of Bulusan. Either one will give you a pretty clear idea of why people left their homeland to come to the new land. Plus, when he gets to the United States, he says essentially, even though he wasn't necessarily, you know, part of everything he said, you know, he makes up a lot of stuff. Let's put it that way. But his description of events, and you know, I see that I've read the new Titus. The copy of it is in Suzzallo Library. But his description of the events, and he also says that he was present at the assassination of de Jungen in Seattle, de Jungen and the other union leader, Simon, in 1936. He wasn't there. But he describes it, and what he does for people who are interested in these things is he establishes a timeline of organization that you know, you had independent unions, and then finally eventually you had the competing AFL CIO, then you had the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and so on and so forth, and then eventually what you had with the coming of Roosevelt was the right to collectively bargain. You know, this is one of the things that the unions had striven for, and finally now it's on paper. That was a huge victory for Pinoys and for all working people on the West Coast and throughout the United States. So, you know, he's not the most skilled writer in the world, but America's in the Heart is a primer. It's a starting point to understand the story of Filipinos in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. And I think it's the most important book still. I like Ben Santos an awful lot. Basically because he's a beautiful writer. I mean, he's really an artist. I was just blown away by the way he crafts words. And his story, Scent of Apples, taught me, amongst other things, how to organize a collection of short stories. I mean, he begins with the present, and then he ends up with the present, and then he goes back into the past. The stories of men in exile surrounding Washington, D.C., and so on. So it's all beautiful, and the stories are linked. It's all very beautifully written. I love his writing. I love Ben's writing, and his empathy is his sense of empathy is where my sense of empathy is. It's not with the elite, because many of those in Washington D.C. were the sons of landowners and so on and so forth. But it's with the little guys, and he's very subtle about his preferences there. But he's a beautiful writer, and he's very subtle. I love, as a writer, I love Ben Santos. As a work, I think America's in the Heart is the most important work of Filipino American literature.
Good. Okay. Now, this next question, I'll tell you my top two Filipino American authors today are you two. Those are my two. And let me just say before, if you guys didn't read the bios, Luisa Igloria currently is Virginia's poet laureate, which she was appointed this year. And of course, Peter Bacho, his first novel, won the American Book Award back in 1992. So if I was going to answer that question, we got the top two right here today. But the question is going to Luisa. Who are your top two Filipino American authors today?
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Alan. We didn't pay him to say that, by the way. Well, I agree that Bulosan continues to be influential, but I think the writers and poets and nonfiction writers today are still dealing with that like narrative of our the history, our history as Filipinos implicated in the colonial and neo-colonial relationship with America. So behind every narrative today, behind every poem, behind every nonfiction work is still, we still have the ability to connect it to that historical framework. So, but among contemporary writers, I like those that are exploding those binary concepts of identity, that you only have to be one thing or another, you can't be both. I think that there's so many, I can't name only two. In fiction, I can think
Well,
of
name one then.
Gina Apostol and Sabina Murray in
Okay.
fiction,
Thank you.
and Elaine Castillo.
There you go. We had her last year, right?
Right, in the
Yes.
literary festival. And her novel is very interestingly called America is Not the Heart. So I see these contemporary writers addressing the gaps that they perceive, the stories that have not yet been told, and that they feel the urgency to include in their work. So she writes not only about the undocumented experience from her point of view in contemporary 21st century America, she also writes about Filipino identities as queer identities. There are all these other ways in which one experiences being Filipino. And it's not only, you know, one thing that we learned about. It's not only the experience of that arc of immigration that winds up in assimilation. So it's not necessarily the only story that they want to tell. In nonfiction, I love Grace Talusan's new book, The Body Papers. I'm trying to look, I'm right here beside the book stacks, but it's too cumbersome to go get up and pull it out. But she read in this year's literary festival. She was here in our virtual festival just a few days ago, reading from the story also of her family's immigration experiences. For a long time, they were undocumented, how it affected them, and also the other things that Filipinos find difficult to talk about, the things that are taboo within communities, talking about sexual harassment and you know, being part of the body of themes that are being looked at by young writers. Malaka Gareb is an Egyptian Filipino American who just came out with a wonderful graphic memoir titled I Was Their American Dream. So I urge you to look at that. It's very like entertaining and also very well done. It has humor and it tells stories from these other points of view that we have not seen before. And a whole cohort of poets, Rick Barot and Eugene Gloria, Erica Malinda, Patrick Osal. So there's so many. I could not just say one or two are my favorites.
Okay, yeah, I understand. I completely understand. But Peter.
Gina's a very good one. I
Hold
agree
on,
with
hold
that.
on, Peter. Before you continue, if you noticed, Peter's screen is blank, and he wanted it like that. So, right, Peter? Anyway, so who are your top two?
I got an arrow sticking out of my head right now. That's the reason I blanked it out. Gina's very good. But I'll also add Erica Malinda, Descartes Heights. I thought it was a very intricate and interesting novel set in the Philippines and to a certain degree in the United States and throughout Asia as well. But you know, it's been a while since I read it, but I was just very impressed by the complexity of the novel and the style of writing. It was very good piece of work. And then, unfortunately, Alex Tizon died recently, but he was one hell of a writer.
Yes.
My Family Slave and The Atlantic was just a wonderful recounting, and it won the national award when it was published for nonfiction writing published in you know. In magazines, American magazines, so won that national award. And Invisible People is also a very good collection of his best pieces as a journalist. So he didn't quite make the crossover yet into fiction writing, but I'm sure that would have come along at some point in time, because he would have had to cross that bridge. And the lure
Right.
of fiction writing is always so powerful. But he was a wonderful writer, just a wonderful writer.
Okay, moving along. Hey, what do you think, Luisa, is the future of Filipino American literature?
I think it is multi-balanced, it is intersectional, it is fluid, it is non-binary, it's going to be, just open to a whole lot of influences. I also want to include, I forgot to mention earlier in your question about Filipino American writers today, Amy Nizuko Matatio is a wonderful poet, and she just came out with a new book of nature essays called World of Wonders. She is the daughter of a South Indian father and a Filipino mother. She was born in Chicago. She teaches now at Mississippi U, and she talked recently about growing up and wondering why she did not find any Filipino authors in the nature writing sections of libraries, although she had always grown up with a love of nature and science because her father had brought her up that way. And so she decided to write this book as partly an answer to that. So again, branching out into other kinds of terrain, other kinds of subject matter that we may not have seen before. So definitely it's an open field. It's a very exciting horizon to anticipate.
Good, good. Peter, what do you think the future is?
It's unlimited. It's whoever catches the bug. My experience, my parents' experience is different from the experiences of people who come over relatively recently. And there are challenges to be sure. So I'm interested in seeing what comes out of these challenges, and how people are prone to literary art are going to express the challenges they face and hopefully overcome.
Good, good, good. Okay, finally, let me ask this question here. What advice can you give someone interested in literature as a career? What advice would you give?
Get a side job.
Luisa.
What did you say? I didn't hear what Peter said.
You don't want to hear it. He's blanked, okay? Go ahead, Luisa. What advice do you give somebody that's interested in literature as a career?
Live a life
Okay, good.
and open yourself to that. The whole works. Embrace it. Feel, like they say, feel all the feels. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable, because
Good.
vulnerability is not necessarily a weakness.
That's right. Cool. Peter.
The comment that I made, get a side job, I guess to get a main
You're going to get blanked again, man. Keep it up.
For me, writing, I only write about things and people that I love, and that's not very many. so it includes your dog Queenie, Alan. I prayed for her at the start.
Okay. Moving on. Let's go.
Years will go between pieces, and I don't write just for the sake of writing. I only write when I really love what I'm writing about. That's relatively limited. You only got so much love to go around, right?
That's right. Okay, now we're gonna give you guys some time here to do a reading, and Peter, you go first. You selected this reading called Bad Attitude, so go ahead and set it up and let's read for us.
Bad Attitude. This is part of a collection. I've been working with the University of Washington Press, which was my publisher of both Cebu and Dark Blue Suit, and after an absence of about 15 years, I've come back to the homeland, and I've been working with the editor, the acquisitions editor, a guy by the name of Mike Bockham, and we'll see what happens. I think it's going to be, some point in the bag, and we'll take it to publication at some point. We're already talking about who the reviewers are going to be. There has to be an academic review and an academic press. But anyway, it's called Mostly True. I mean, that's the name of the collection. It's mostly true stories about the Oak community that your host and I grew up in. And it starts out with 7 maps. I think 2 of the maps are listed, right?
Yes, earlier, but I'm putting up bad attitude. The people are reading it right now, so go ahead, do your reading.
So 7 maps, and this is, and then followed by a series of stories, and this is one of them. It's called Bad Attitude. If there was an American term beloved by my dad and his generation and passed along to their American-born sons, it's this: fuck you. It's what they said to white men on the racist and violent West Coast when Pinoys wore zoot suits, hung out on street corners, and dated and often married white women. Monkeys, you called us, niggers. Fair enough, then we will use our secret jungle potions and our jungle boogie dancing to lure your women and not give them back. White men, we will break your laws against race mixing, we will Mongolize your tribe, and as you get older, we will live in your cities and towns, maybe even your neighborhoods. You will watch our children grow and have the better lives that we could never have. May you shrivel in your hatred. May you die unmourned, unloved. Fuck you. That's also what the Manong said in the 1930s when they formed militant labor unions, striking and sometimes wildcat striking their way to better wages and conditions in the fields and salmon counters. The reason I'm reading this is because there are historical sorts of elements in here that I think young Pinoys need to know. Finally, it's what the legendary labor leader Laureate Leong told farmers in Delano when he led Filipino grape pickers off the fields in 1965. The ongoing strike caught the nation's attention and led to the pop culture beatification of the humble, pious, and made-for-television Cesar Chavez, who led the Mexican workers. In too many narratives, Filipinos played a marginal role or were ignored altogether. But make no mistake, it was the younger, less certain, and less experienced Chavez who followed Itliang off the fields, not the other way around. This defiance was inherited by their American-born sons. Flash forward to what a Pinoy buddy said about the U.S. Army when he got his draft notice during the Vietnam War. Fuck the Army, he said defiantly. I am joining the Marines. To me, the first part made sense. The second, maybe not so much. But I understood the attitude. Misguided? Maybe. But defiant? Like father, like son. Very Pinoy. It's also what another friend, Eddie, said a second before he punched an off-duty cop in the head. I shouldn't have been at the scene at that junior high school gym on a weekday night. I was in law school prepping for the next day's class when my buddy Steve called. Grab your tennis shoes, he said. Rec league game, and the Pinoys are a couple of dudes short. Be by in 10. Why not? I needed a break from wills and trusts. The Filipino team was a motley crew with a changing cast of characters who smoked cigarettes and never practiced between games. T-shirts, shorts, cutoffs, and sweatpants were a uniform for the night. My playing days, years in the past, allowed me to take a spot on the bench, catch up with friends, and watch the game. Mismatch from the start. The Filipinos were much shorter and thinner than our beefier and taller opponents, but the differences didn't end there. The cops actually called out and ran plays, set screens, and looked for the open man. They played defense, wore matching uniforms, and practiced during the week. In contrast, Pinoy ballers were not inclined to pass, but to pay attention to the other basic aspects of teamwork. On offense, dribble and shoot was how we played, which meant that the first one to touch the ball was also the last, which was cool because we understood it. Our style of play was less about winning, although sometimes that happened, and more about highlighting individual skills and drawing oohs and ahs from appreciative teammates and fans for the distance-defying jump shot, or better still, a quick drive to the hole, avoiding flailing defenders too slow to respond. In other words, art versus function on the junior high school basketball court. And tonight, art was getting stomped. Down by 10 after 5 minutes, I knew it would only get worse. I leaned back in my chair and turned to Ray, a friend I hadn't seen in months. Hey, man, I began but didn't finish the sentence. Motherfucker, fuck you, a familiar voice from the court screamed, followed by a loud thwack. Ah, man, Ray said. It's Eddie. Eddie's victim bent over and moaning, held a hand over his eye. His brother cops formed a protective circle around him. Like yaks, I thought, but smaller, whiter, and not as furry. One teammate handed the wounded cop a towel to stop the bleeding from a cut above the eye. Another walked him off the court. Your boy hit me in the balls, Eddie screamed, glaring and pointing angrily at the cops. What the hell would you do? At 5'10", 170 pounds, Eddie wasn't physically imposing. Other dangerous men were bigger and stronger, but no one was as fierce. He was a berserker and would gladly fight anyone dumb enough to step forward to take him on. No one did. As the impasse continued, Hooray sighed, then joined up and walked onto the court. Come on, brother. You may need some backup. The rest of us joined him. As it turned out, Eddie didn't need our help. The cops turned and walked toward their bunch, picked up their bags, and left. Fuck this, one screamed as he walked out the door. You're just lucky we're cops. We were lucky? Sure, I thought, an embarrassing off-duty brawl and its consequences. Bad publicity, letters of reprimand, maybe even suspensions without pay. Consequences considered, no doubt. But also considered was snarling, dangerous Eddie, a foaming two-legged dog willing to fight any one or all of them, one-on-one or all at once. Almost 50 years later, my bottom line, the cops were lucky too. I am sitting here remembering, knowing that the first generation has vanished, and that their children have had children, perhaps grandchildren too, and that these stories, their stories, well, they have much in common with the stories of other immigrants in America. The Manung's attitude of defiance is unique. Such stories have not been told or told, have been forgotten or not listened to by too many younger Filipinos. But that indifference may be slowly changing. Young Filipinos have gone to Delano, visiting, writing about, and producing films focused on laureate and the pivotal Filipino role in the 1965 Delano grape strike. In terms of shining, defiant moments in Pinoy history, it's hard to top Leong and the Delano Pinoys for what they did in 1965. And this is the reason that I'm reading this today, because it's something that people don't know about. But such a moment does exist in Seattle. It's all but forgotten detail described in a lawsuit argued before the United States Supreme Court, ILWU Local 37 versus Boyd, 1954. Every spring, Local 37 sent thousands of Pinoys north to the Alaskan salmon canneries. But the United States was in the middle of the communist hunting tsunami unleashed by Senator Joseph McCarthy. And Boyd, the Seattle-based District Director of Immigration and Naturalization Services, was more than happy to do his part. His target, Local 37. In 1953, Boyd's office twisted federal immigration law and threatened, and this is within quotes, to treat aliens domiciled in the continental United States, returning from temporary work in Alaska as if they were aliens entering the United States for the first time. By 1953, many of Local 37's members had become American citizens against whom Boyd's threat would not apply, but others were not. When the Philippines became independent in 1946, it cut the legal tie between America and its former colony. It also changed the status of thousands of Pinoys. Overnight, and despite decades in America, they lost their status and protection as American nationals. Aliens is what they became. And under American law, aliens seeking entry to this country for the first time could be excluded for any number of reasons, including disfavored political affiliations. Chris Mansalvas, the local's president, was the unreachable itch that triggered Boyd's obsession. Among Filipinos, the one-legged Mansalvas was legendary, committed, courageous, and tough. And Pinoys, no strangers to hardship, admired these traits. But he was also an unabashed communist, unforgivable during the paranoia of the McCarthy era, when many Americans yearned for peace and for simple answers to the questions raised by an increasingly complex and hostile post-war world. In 1945, the United States and its allies had defeated fascism. Yet just the next year, Winston Churchill warned of an iron curtain caused by the Soviet Union's aggressive westward expansion. Then in 1949, China, an important wartime ally, fell to communist forces in that country's civil war. And finally, in 1950, American soldiers were battling Chinese communists on the Korean Peninsula. The speed and sheer scope of the global changes were breathtaking. not at all to America's liking. Within this unsettling milieu, Senator Joe McCarthy provided the snake oil to soothe the nation's jangled nerves. Subversives, he claimed, were the problem, and he knew who they were. Communists and sympathizers could be found in government, universities, labor unions, the arts. His charges, most of which were unfounded, were dutifully reported by a meek and uncritical American press. But in the early 1950s, the McCarthy era had shaped the tenor of American life, giving rise to blacklists, arrests, guilt by innuendo and association, terminations, and ruined lives. In those days, the INS building and Local 37 headquarters were within walking distance of each other. It must have galled Boyd and other immigration officials that a communist-led union could be so brazen as to openly operate and thrive in the agency's backyard. Hence the threat in 1953. INS's goal, I am sure, was to force the rank and file to remove Mensalvas. But he continued as president until 1959, or 5 years after McCarthy was censured by the Senate and 2 years after his death in 1957. And each spring, and despite the threat, Local 37 would send Pinoys north for decades to come. But why were these workers, most of whom were not communists, so unfailingly loyal to a marked man? For starters, group solidarity, strengthened by years of racial hostility, had become an article of faith shared by members of the first Pinoy generation. This is how we survive. But that's not all. In 1943, I wrote this about Monsalvas. They stayed loyal to Chris because he understood them and their needs, and he spoke their language. That was his magic. He could speak to anyone. And that person would believe, or would at least want to believe, Chris's talent, that human touch, worked in spite of his ideology, not because of it. In retrospect, the rank and file's defiance was both brave and audacious during a time when other Americans drew their shades and cowered in their homes, and turncoats kept busy naming names. But not at Local 37, where union members made abundantly clear that they, not the federal government, would choose who they want to lead them. That's our decision. That's who we are, the old Pinoy said. And oh, one more thing, Mr. Boyd, Mr. Big Shot, Mr. Polished Floor Shine Shoes, fuck you.
Good. Right on, Peter. Right on.
Thanks.
Okay, Luisa. We've got 2 poems here. I'll bring up this first one. You could.
Well, is it okay if I read?
Go ahead.
Is it okay if I read 3?
You just tell me which ones, or can you get it on your end?
I will read the 2 America poems, but I'd also like to read something that I just thought was appropriate now that you don't have. But I want to say, though, that when you asked us to speak a little bit about Filipino American activisms, and I thought about this in relation to literature, there's such a thing as performative activism. I think we've heard about that. But in our literature, it's almost as if the very fact that we are writing is a form of activism in itself, as we continue to push back against invisibility, against our misrepresentations in history, of course, against specific social injustices in our time. But also, it is very important that we are the ones that write about these experiences that are true to our organic experiences of self and community. So no matter how compelling, for instance, a story like, what is that, Memoirs of a Geisha was, it was not written by an Asian American author, so I cannot give credit to that being a work of Asian American literature. So similarly, we've got to write our stories, we've got to write our poems. Yes. So I want to start with a poem that is not in the packet that Alan prepared. It's short, but I want to do it as a kind of preface. The title is And Honey, as in land off, or half the name my people gave this place when they imagined how it would feel to arrive at a destination different from one ordained at birth. It's easy to admire those who have no difficulty securing passage, easing into a tongue practiced in schools with toilets and running water. It's easy to shame those who believed the lies, who sold the family farm, the water buffalo, the agate beads and heirloom jars, those who traded 2 seasons for 4, one leafed in russet and gold as vegetation entered into a long quietus they came to understand did not necessarily mean death. Apples redden and fall in 100 orchards, and bees propel themselves into a riot of flowers. All that must be gathered is nearly level with the earth and requires a bending. All I'm saying is some don't need to think twice, dipping the spoon into the sweet. Some walk the rows long after sundown, or lower the netting over their faces before counting the jars and hefting crates onto trucks. Okay, now I'll read the To America poems. I've been writing these sort of letter poems to America because I've seen other poets who are doing that, and I thought that I could write my own sort of epistolary letter poem to America. They're not published in any book or journal yet. They're part of my daily writing practice. So this one you might probably recognize as related to that incident of racism in, I think it was in a California restaurant a few months ago. This is called You Can't Talk to Us Like That. America, I've got a touch of cabin fever too, and wish I could go to a favorite restaurant again, walk down a short flight of steps into the cool brick-lined interior of what used to be a speakeasy. Wouldn't it be great to order a dozen each of the local oyster varieties, some bread and butter, a nice pull of something bubbly? We'd sing happy birthday or happy anniversary while clinking glasses and taking group pictures. But what if there's a man at a nearby table whose hatred boils over at the sight of anyone, but especially brown people like us, having the gumption to reach for a little joy during this time of sickness and despair, which sometimes feels worse than death? America, he thinks we cannot be in the same room with him, so we get video rolling. We ask him to repeat the hateful obscenities he's hurled our way so he can be held accountable and shown out of the building. We hold our ground, America. After all the years our kind broke their backs and your hard soil to bring fruit and grain to your table, just so you can put a clean white cloth and a crystal service on it, after graveyard shifts during which our kind daily tend to your sick and dying. We have the right to be here, and the wages are overdue.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. One more poem. This one I chose to read because it's sort of got a Norfolk thingy with MacArthur.
Okay.
This is called America Returns. So it's the whole idea of return, the theme of returning. What does that mean? America, it's been a while since we've taken visitors downtown to the memorial of the general who wore his sunglasses like he was in a commercial and not the Southeast Asian theater of war where soldiers impaled babies on bayonets, thrust their dicks into peasant women, and in the heat of April set thousands of gaunt prisoners of war on the long march from Bagak and Mariveles to Camp O'Donnell in Capas, Tarlac. The docents will point out the general's effects and the famous picture of his dramatic later landing, striding knee-deep into the surf as cameras click away. America, this is you with your stern jaw, somehow dwarfing both the archipelago's president and the little statesman barely 5 feet and 4 inches in his dress shoes, This is you saying, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again in the blood of our two peoples. After Liberation Day, my father, already in his early 30s, climbed up a tree so he wouldn't have to share 3 whole bars of Hershey's milk chocolate. As they rumbled into town in their jeeps, American soldiers had thrown these and packs of nylons by the handful at people running and cheering alongside. My father laughed, recalling that he'd staged his own kind of liberation in the bushes. Oh, America, you've left and returned, but have also never left. Your companies continue to harvest ore and tobacco and pineapples. You play war games in Apocalypse Now sets of jungles, then go off base to pick up bar girls in Olongapo or Angeles. Some of them wind up like the tragic heroine in that typical operatic ending. She takes her life because the foreign hero who was supposed to return left on a boat to find himself a real American wife. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Luisa. Well, there we have it, Fawns Now fans. 2 of our top Filipino Americans literature. Let's give it for Luisa Igloria and my man, Peter Bacho. Let's give him a round of applause. And Ray, take us home.
Thank you.
Ray. Ray.
No, I'm right here. So, thank you guys so much for sharing that. I've been taking notes for Peter. It's been a while since I've seen you, along with Dr. Igloria. I've been looking at the chat, and I've seen a lot of folks who have been sharing some of their suggestions in terms of Filipino American writing, and I really do appreciate that. And I guess at this point, if any of you guys have any questions specific to our presenters today, I can monitor the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just ask them questions. And also I'd like to say, as I'm looking at this group right now in the Zoom, we have a very talented group in this audience. I feel like most Filipinos at heart are artists, right? And so, you know, it's really good to see a lot of you guys. And I see a lot of my my mentors that I haven't seen in a long time, Mr. P, also Ben specifically, and it's really good to see you guys as well. So, you know, the heart of the Filipino, I think is an artist, and I'm really glad to have, you know, Peter and Luisa here. So if you guys have any questions or comments for Luisa and Peter, that'd be awesome. And I'll look at it in the chat, or you guys can just
Raymond, Ray, this is Jeff. I got one for both of you.
Sure.
And it's not so much Filipino American history, but when I was serving overseas in Iraq, in the Middle East, I ran into Filipinos everywhere as part of the diaspora. Is there any artwork coming out about their experiences? Because they're not here in the United States. They're in a different part of the world, but the mission's the same. Make money, send it home to family.
Yeah.
And is there any literature out about them, artists from that part, living in that part of the world, talking about that Filipino experience?
Yes. Mia Alvar has a collection of powerful short stories called In the Country. And she has a couple of stories there that depict that community in the Middle East. Also, the poet Sasha Pimentel, who spent part of her growing up years, because I think her father or her mother or both of her parents had been working in the Middle East. So she also has that experience that she writes about in some of her poems. So look them up. They're wonderful writers.
Thank you.
Ray, I just want to make a comment.
Okay, Edwina, go ahead. If you want to speak into your mic a little bit, Edwina, because it's always kind of hard to hear you.
Okay, how is it? Can you hear me
That's
now?
good. Go ahead.
Peter, I just wanted to say bravo. You capture the moments of my grandparents and how they felt about coming to this country. Also, bravo, Luisa, just capturing the feelings of many today. And I thank both of you for giving me that perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I see
Thank you.
Sylvia. Sylvia, I think you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
I do. I wanted to follow up on what you said, and that's that seems like all Filipinos are artists in some way or another. My question for our poets: why do you think that is? Why does it seem that there are so many talented writers in the Filipino community?
Why? Because we rock.
Is there a genetic rock in there or something?
No, I think, we talk about multiculturalism within the American setting, but I think that before we even heard of that word, I mean, the Philippines is an archipelagic nation, and that ultimately, I think, predisposes us to various influences. And even if we may not be conscious of it, I think those enter into whatever cultural part of the cultural fabric we have been exposed to. So it's kind of like natural that we kind of gravitate towards many rich experiences, and that will probably show in our artwork or our creations.
I have a question for I think anyone who wants to answer really. Going on to the discussion about all Filipinos are artists in the heart. So I'm really kind of curious because there's some folks out there that I've seen their work and and I've read their work, and I'm just kind of curious. So as somebody who grew up in the 1990s spoken word era back in the day, a lot of my writings had to do with being therapeutic, right? But the question that I had is, do you guys worry about it being good for the audience or just being good for you? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to answer that.
Peter, do you want to go first?
The first audience that I try to please is myself.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. If I can, well, when I finish a page and I'm quiet at night and I can read it, if it sounds musical, then I'm happy. I please myself. I mean, whatever standards I have. And if by chance it pleases people who read it, that's fine too. But that's kind of like, this is the dressing. But I can be a very harsh critic of my own writing. I'm very harsh, and if something's off, I know it. But if the reason, writing is such a personal venture that your first audience is yourself as a writer.
Right. I agree with that part about your first audience being yourself. I guess this is a question for audience, but also we always, when we create or when we write, even if we're only doing it or initially doing it in the solitude with our writing, there's still another you that I think we may be addressing. Even if we may not be sure at the moment of writing or creating what this you is, we are also talking outward to something other than ourselves. It can't just be all like muttering to ourselves. So I think though that it's very hard to kind of like just listen to the marketing side of writing, because there is that. So the idea is that no matter what is trendy, no matter what is out there that people are saying you should write about, you need to be true to your own integral version or vision of what you want to do in your art. That being said, I also want to say, because people say things like, oh, do you write for therapeutic purposes, for catharsis? And I say that if you can afford therapy, go get therapy. But do not use your art as therapy. It is not, you're doing that because of the art itself. You're doing that because you want to pursue, this work with language that you love in the first place.
Right.
If I may say something.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Lisa Gino, and I've been writing since I was a child, only because I fell in love with books. I fell in love with books, and so I love to write. And to answer the question, for me, it's actually releasing a spirit. Something in me wants to come out, and so I write it. So, like, you know, I'm slowly falling asleep, and an idea comes in my mind. I just have to grab a pen and paper or my iPhone and just talk it out or write it out or type it out. And I was so fortunate to grow up in a small town that had so many living artists. Like my next door neighbor was Lucia San Pedro in Angono, Rizal, and the artist Francisco Botong Francisco was also there. So you go to church and the church is full of his stuff. And they sing Lucia San Pedro. So it's like, I've been so lucky to experience all of this. And so for me, it's more like just releasing my spirit. And and sometimes even when the feeling's really so good, there's even a melody in my brain that goes with whatever it is I write, whether it be a poem, just 2 or 3 lines or a whole chapter. That it's personal. It's deeply personal.
Yes, and being able to touch that creative impulse, I think, is what gives us that high. Because when we do get in touch with that side of ourselves, which is very intimate, it's very personal, it's also not just about ego anymore, if you get what I'm saying. It's not because the I wants to put something out there in the world that they can attach their name to. It becomes this sort of correspondence with that side where the creation comes from.
Thank you. Those are really great answers. I'm sorry, I was just looking at the comment by Anna. I haven't met you. Hey, Anna, how are you doing? I thought that was something that was pretty profound. Can you speak on that a little bit? Because I think your perspective is a little bit different from a lot of other folks. So, hey, Anna, I'm Ray. Good meeting you. Thanks for coming.
Hey, Ray, thank you. I'm Peter. Peter's my uncle.
All right.
And, yeah. So when he was talking about the Manong generation, and so is Alan unofficially, but so when you're talking about the Manong generation, one of the things I think that's really challenging is that those stories are starting to, as I put, drift away. Like the image that was coming to my head are like the ashes in which our lolos and lolas are returning. And so given that it's the Filipino culture has traditionally been more of an oral tradition and that we're now living in white normativity, kiddos that are raised here are grown up learning that the way to knowledge is through a book when they're going through traditional education, and I work in the educational profession. And so one of the trends that we're seeing is that because there aren't as many Filipino authors out there, or because most of our traditional curriculum is white normative, so we don't see authors who look like us. We tend to push it off as the Filipino culture being not learned or not traditional, or continuing to be different. And then as we're seeing the trend of, in the next 20 years, it'll probably be 60+% of people are identified as mixed race. One of the things that's really challenging is, oh, well, I'm 50% Filipino and I'm 50% white, therefore I'm not a whole person. And so moving that idea to being 100% Filipino, 100% white, and then how do I navigate the challenges within that? And what Luisa was saying about feeling all the feels, that's one of the things that Elaine Castillo has been talking about as well in terms of mentoring and growing your leadership to support people of color.
Right. Thank you for that, Anna. That's really true. I resonate with what you said. And the idea of 100% this or other, the idea of authenticity, what does that even mean anyway? So for instance, also in the MFA creative writing world, all my experience has been seeing, as you said, also normative texts in terms of craft. They tell you to write in a certain way. But when I talk, for instance, about my education in craft, I want to include how my mother taught me how to cook rice using, the measurement of the fingers. I think that was some of my earliest lessons in craft, because craft is all about knowing how to do things in a world that you become aware of, and using all the skills that you have. So it isn't, as you said, it isn't just book learning that goes into the making of our literature or our art, but it's everything that we are organically or that defines us. So, you know, people who say that you're not authentic because you're not full, that's just BS.
I've got something to say.
Okay, Peter.
That my generation, people born in the 40s and 50s, I'd say about half of them were mestizo. And I mean, it wasn't a racial purity thing at all. It's like, what culture did you identify with? And some of them that identified with us didn't have any Filipino. If you're going to look at, you know, just pure biology, didn't have any Filipino blood whatsoever. But this is the group that they identified with. It was a strong culture, as opposed to any kind of racial purity test. That was bullshit then. It's bullshit now.
Interesting. Interesting.
Raymond, this is Ben. Can I speak?
Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
As in Ben Manor? As in Ben Manor?
The Ben Manor.
All right, guys. Well, first of all, thank you, Hampton Road, for putting this on. You guys are just outstanding. I feel I'm part of your family in Virginia Beach.
You are.
Second, your collection of writers are just outstanding. It just fills my heart. You know that we've been doing this for so long. And of course, we can't forget Uncle Fred and Auntie Dorothy. And hearing Peter's voice haunts me in the past when it used to be Saturday Night Fever, Peter. But I do have to say this. Besides our literary works, in the 70s and the 80s, our literary writers were the grant writers of our community. They're the ones that wrote the story about Filipinos in trying to get grants and funds to give service to our community, to our students and our seniors and our workers. That's one. Second, the only reason why I write is because I write for a cause. So I'm an organizer and we don't have time to write, but when it's time to write, it's because there's a purpose in that writing. And so I just want to share that because there are many of us from that area, that era, that we became writers because it was for survival, to give light, as well as to give support in like what Raymond got funded, and then he created his spoken word productions, and the students achieved because of Raymond. And you know, I see Robert Floor, who, you know, he was a grant writer and then became a full writer. And Oscar, I mean, he is Mr. P in the Bay Area, you know, P for whatever you want to put behind it. You know, he is the writer for our Bay Area. So there are many who have gone through the struggle. And when we bring up about our great Americans in the Heart, he, you know, created that spirit of making us want to express ourselves on paper, whether if it's grant writing or it's organizing, but there's always something literary about the art of survival. And I think I see many faces that can tell you about their art because of the survival of the Filipino. So anyway, it's great seeing all of you. I mean, gosh, all the faces, almost everybody. Wow, Barbara's even on. Okay. Yeah, Barbara Bragano. There you are, sweetheart. Anyway, it's wonderful. And for the young folks, this is a privilege. Because if we had this, right, Alan, and you know, Jeffrey, way back when, then we would know so much more about the coming of the landing of Leyte, right? And that we would know how to celebrate it because it's our manongs who became soldiers, who went back and took back the country that they left. So hurrah to our writers. Luisa, I am overwhelmed. You are truly a gift to our community. So to all of you, I know I don't get a chance to come in on these Zooms. I get sometimes 4 Zooms at the same time, but tonight it's Fawns. So happy Filipino American History Month.
Right on, Ben. Right on.
Thank you. And as I'm looking
Thanks, Ben.
You're welcome.
Wait a second, Ben. I just wanted to say thank you. You encouraged me to write the grant on the aunties and uncles.
Oh yeah, yes.
Influenced us in Virginia Beach. Thank you.
Great writers are writers too.
Right. Great. There's a question from Cacophony that's very interesting.
Yeah. Do you want to go? I was actually going to go back to the chat. I was going to encourage folks to look at the chat because it's a really healthy discussion. Louisa, you want to go ahead and answer that one for me?
Yeah. So the question of Cacophony is, what are the ways in which you work to decolonize normative white artistic academic spaces? How do you navigate these spaces? And the way I do it in specific ways in my teaching, in my classroom is one, I always offer a diverse reading list and I teach workshops, right? So I have never been comfortable with what they do is when a writer brings work to the workshop table, they're not supposed to speak until everyone has said, and gone around the table to say something, offer their critiques. But I'm not comfortable with the cone of silence model either. And that comes from the very first Iowa Writers Workshop models, which is the oldest writing workshop in the USA. I feel that it already would tend to even silence more those marginalized voices in the classroom or in the workshop space. So I tell my students, we're not doing this. We're not doing the cone of silence. We are having a conversation in which the writer also has, just as much a stake in the conversation as anybody else does, because sometimes the cone of silence model might make the writer feel like they don't even know their own work, right? They don't know what they were trying to say. So those are some of the ways in which I try to do that in the classroom.
Thank you. That is, thank you, Louisa, for that very important answer to a very important question. As I'm looking at the chat, I'm just kind of scrolling through. I'm seeing a lot of great suggestions, and I'm asking you guys to look through the chat because it looks like there's a lot of really good comments in it. Also, one of the great things about how we're doing the Zoom now is that we can always friend people and through different social media avenues to continue the conversation, right? So after this, with some of you guys, I'll go ahead and request a friend invite if you guys would accept to kind of like figure out and also continue the conversation moving forward. Does anyone else have a question that they just want to say out loud?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, thank you.
Not so much a question as in 2022, the next Fawns conference, which is in July, I'm organizing the literary and arts portion of this. And so I want to not just thank everybody who spoke here today and presented today, but I'm hoping you will all come out for that. And because I'm hoping some of you will be on the program, but also there'll be a chance to meet some of the very young Filipino writers that are emerging here. There's actually been about 3 or 4 residents out of Hugo House, which is a big writing program here, and several out of the Jack Straw program that have young Filipino Americans. So I'm going to try and get them involved in the program as well. So it's something to look forward to because it's almost like we're experiencing a little renaissance of sorts in the area. So I would like to invite everybody.
Yeah. I apologize, Robert. Can you just tell folks where you're located and where you're coming
I'm in
from?
Seattle.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I'm just up the road from Peter Bacho. We actually went to the same high school, and worst of all, we actually shared a house together for about 9 months.
I feel like that's going to be an entire workshop into itself.
Raymond, Raymond, this is Ben. Can I ask a question to
Sure, go ahead, Ben.
the great writers in this Zoom? I always hear, and I work with college students and mostly through the PCN movement, but I always hear the young writers. Could we dispel the young? Because I think there are many people who, like Lisa said, all of a sudden there's this thing that comes out of you, and all of a sudden you become expressive through literary, and maybe you had the skills to write, or maybe you went back and learned to write, but now you're 40 years old. So, and what I say that because sometimes people think, oh gosh, I'm 40, I'm 50, I really can't do anything for the community. And I always say, you never know when your calling comes up, and that could be when you're 60. So could we have an agreement that it's not about the young, it's about just coming out to become a writer, whether you are 20 years old or even 50 years old to maybe 60 years old. The fact is that you can contribute to the works, literary works of our community.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I have a question that I like to ask as an educator here. I've been doing this for over 20 years. One of the things that I'm kind of challenged with, and I see it around how the youth kind of express themselves now, is that I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe it's just my experience, I feel like a lot of their work is becoming increasingly narcissistic without a sense of historical background. If you guys understand what I'm saying, like a lot of the artistic work, which is they're doing, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with it, but as I'm looking at the folks who on this monitor, a lot of your work has been really rooted in a lot of historical experiences. And from what I'm seeing, maybe just from where I am from in my little corner of Virginia, I don't see a whole lot of that exploration with identity through a historical lens. I was wondering if any of you guys could speak on that.
Well,
Yeah.
I can.
Go ahead.
The first two generations were faced with the reality of some very, first generation particularly, second generation to a somewhat lesser degree, but the first generation was, they had to deal with expulsions, they had to deal with flat out racism, they had to deal with racial riots, they had to deal with killings. My generation, there was still racial resentment and so on and so forth. So my writing reflects that. Now, the writing of younger Filipinos, maybe it certainly doesn't reflect what those first two generations went through. And so they don't feel that sort of reality. So they're going to write on art for art's sake, I suspect, right? And maybe it is becoming more narcissistic. That's the reality. That is the reality. But it's not my reality.
Thank you, Peter.
Mm-hmm.
Luisa, do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, I don't know that I would make a blanket statement about all. Yeah, are you talking about Filipino American people or
Yeah, from my experience, for what I've seen lately coming out. I mean, like I said, I could be wrong, but you're probably a little bit more attuned in the writing sense than I am.
Okay, so like I said, or I was starting to say, I would not make a blanket statement. Maybe they're just looking for forms in which to express their realities in ways that are also organic to their experience. This generation is very attuned to digital media, and they're using that in all aspects of their communication, all aspects of their life. But I think that if we give them a chance to discover more of their connection to history, I think then things start to click and they make sense. Maybe try collaborative work with them, doing things together rather than people doing projects just by themselves. My youngest daughter is a sophomore this year at ODU, and she became involved in FASA of her own volition. I didn't force her into it. I didn't say anything. She made that choice herself, and now she's a cultural liaison chair. And she is looking for ways to connect not only the students in her cohort with histories here, she also wants to reach out to other experiences of Filipino, young people, their cohort in the Philippines, and to have that conversation. So I think that's great. I think that if we tap into the forms that they are attuned to, then it's probably more conducive to them, and it's something that they can probably wrap their heads around. But it's true that this is a very I generation, not just Filipino American kids, but everybody, and I think the solitary experience of being in the pandemic, only interacting with people in this way is also not helpful for building that sense of like physical community. So we need to find ways, more creative ways to overcome that.
Thank you. I mean, that's definitely a relevant topic, I feel like, when it comes to the way that folks are interacting, especially with the students, with being zoomed out constantly, like we all experience with virtual learning. So thank you. Are there any other questions or comments that we have? As I'm looking at the chat, you guys can help me kind of look at it too when it comes to moderating. Anything at all? Alan, do you want to say any final words?
Yes, let me share a screen real quick here. On the 18th, we're having this We Are Fawns. And it's magical because that's the reason why Filipino American History Month was formed, was to recognize October 18th, 1587, as the first landing of Filipinos on continental United States. So we are going to start unveiling the history of our own organization because we celebrate our 40th anniversary in July. And despite its popularity as one of the most recognized Filipino American national organizations in the United States, the history of its transformation from a handful of community-based educators in Seattle in 1982 to today's powerful network of institutionalized academia remains relatively unknown to the general public and to its general membership as well. So this session is going to initiate this unveiling. And the question would be to Auntie Dorothy, of the past 18 national Fawns national conferences, which ones are the most memorable and why? And now, if you think you were a conference chair, if you think it was memorable, you need to attend to see if you're on that list. So we have the sign up sheet going on. I encourage you guys to come check it out. Also, we have other events this week. Let me see if I can get to it. Towards the end, Seattle Greater Fawns, they're conducting a workshop on October 15th and October 17th. And you click on that and you'll get this thing here where they're going to talk about activism, hotbed of Filipino American civil rights activism on Thursday. You guys all have that. Dolores Sabanga, Tony Ogilvie, Andres Tangalan. Then the Far West Convention, that'll be on Saturday. Then on Sunday, we'll talk about Fawns. Also, here is the, remember Claire's clip on the Yakima Valley. Well, you got it on the sheet now, on the handout, so you could click on that and you can actually see it now at home, okay? So I'd like to thank our special guests, Luisa Igloria, Virginia Poet Laureate, my dear friend and neighbor, Peter Bacho. Hopefully, next time we see him, he will reveal his face.
And hey, man, it's a tech glitch.
No. I know you're protesting, my boy. I know you're protesting. It's just too deep. It's just really deep. But and I'd like to thank everybody out there. Hey, I told you to get together 4:30 so we could figure out some technical glitches, right? Well, brother, you need to pay your bill. You need to pay your bill. Buy yourself a computer.
Oh, there you go.
I'll bill Auntie Dorothy.
Okay.
Hey,
but thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give a virtual round of applause to our special icons in Filipino American history, Dr. Luisa Igloria, and my boy, my man, my mentor, Peter Bacho.
Also, I encourage everyone to I send out some friend requests for people that I'm not friends with. So hopefully we can continue the conversation that way. If you guys want to stay on the Zoom and kind of chop it up and kind of hang out, I'm going to stay for another 5 minutes. I'm sure Alan and some other folks will too. Otherwise, this was a great event. We're going to continue on celebrating Filipino American history. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for the presenters. We'll see you guys soon. If you want to stay on, you're welcome to hang out.
Okay, recording
is good.
on.
That's good, Alan.
Luisa,
good.